So before we get into a lot of the heavy meat and potatoes of business and politics, we're just going to talk very briefly about the structure of the American government. And I realize that I'm going over this very, very briefly. But I realize that you could do dozens and dozens of classes just on the structure of the American government. I'm only giving a very superficial discussion of this because I assume you're familiar with these concepts already. Okay? So the U.S. government is different than a lot of countries because we have a federal system. And that's a government where powers are divided between a national government or a federal government and our 50 state governments. We also have separation of powers and judicial review, and I'm going to talk about all of those in just a second. Furthermore, the First Amendment, and this is going to be a theme that recurs throughout this module, protects the right of business to organize and press its agenda on the government. In many ways, the right of a business to press its agenda on the government is a form of free speech. Okay? And that winds up getting into our discussion of lobbying. But first of all, let's talk about a federal system. And the federal system means that there's a central government and subdivision governments. And some of you may be thinking, well, what if the federal government says X and the government of, I don't know, California or Texas decides they want to do something completely different? Well, the answer to that is the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause basically says that when the federal government passes some sort of a law, all states are bound by that law. Now, states are free to add to the basic principle of the federal statute as long as it does not interfere with the original intent of the law. Let me give an example. You can have a federal minimum wage, and it's always changing, but let's say the federal minimum wage, we set it at $8 an hour. The state of California is free to have a California state minimum wage of $15 an hour, but it cannot go below the 8 set by the federal government. Okay. The federal government could set a minimum or a maximum amount of pollution that could come from a certain kind of power plant. That's fine. The state could add to that limit and say, or detract from that limit and say, actually, in the state of California, we want a more stringent environmental standard than one proposed by the federal government, as long as that standard didn't get so egregious that it prevented companies from operating altogether. Again, it's about furthering the federal government's intent, not restricting it or undermining it in any sort of way. So that's what the Supremacy Clause is. Now, we also, in our particular system, we have the separation of powers. And the separation of powers basically says that in our system of government, and we've kind of borrowed this from the British, we have the legislative, that's our Congress or our House of Representatives and the Senate. We have our executive branch, which is the president and all of the executive agencies. And the judicial, that's the courts. So those are divided into 3 different branches, and each of the branches has a degree of independence and power to check and balance the power of the others. This actually, well, it comes from the British system, but it was formalized as an idea by Baron de Montesquieu, a French political scientist during the Enlightenment era. So the legislative, the executive, and the judicial functions of the national government exist in some way to make sure that one does not have an overwhelming degree of power over the others. And kind of a corollary to that, I've always thought that in the federal system, states can also serve as some sort of a check on the federal government. So if the federal government were to pass unfair or unjust laws, states in some way, in defiance of the Supremacy Clause, can pass their own legislation as a way to challenge the federal government. So I've always thought that that's kind of the fourth check of the check and balance, but that's just me. You're free to disagree with that. We also have the judicial review. And judicial review basically says that judges can review any sort of legislative or executive actions and nullify or strike down any laws that the courts deem as unconstitutional, or if they believe that politicians or government officials exceed their constitutionally granted authority. So these are kind of some basic terms. These are terms that will come back over and over again during this module, but I just want you to have these in the back of your mind. Now, in our next video, we're going to talk about business history, but from a perspective of government intervening in business activities. I'm looking forward to seeing you then.